Hi, my name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will pick one thing and dive into it for about 10 to 15 minutes, and at the end, hopefully we have a better idea of how it happened. Hey guys, new podcast this week, and the focus of it is rubber bands, and I will say that while on the surface it might not seem that interesting, there are some interesting points to it. I will go ahead and cue you in and say that there is a connection to the Nazis, which makes, I think, everything seem a little more interesting. But I really hope you guys enjoy it, and we're going to go ahead and start. Okay, if we're going to talk about rubber bands, we first have to talk about where rubber comes from and the different types of rubber out there. Before doing this research, I had a vague idea about where it came from, but honestly, I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but I honestly thought it came out of the tree black already. Like, I did. The rubber tree, or rubber plant, is a flowering plant from the Euphorbiaceae family, and I'm pretty sure I pronounced that correctly. What comes out of the tree is a milk-like substance called latex, which is the main component in rubber. I did not know that latex was naturally occurring either. Racking up a list pretty quick of things that I do not know. The trees can grow to up to 140 feet tall in the wild, but when grown specifically for their latex, they are usually smaller because taking the latex restricts the growth of the tree, which is sad when you think about it. In a video I watched, they didn't look to be more than 20 feet tall, maybe a little bit more. In that video, they're cutting into the rubber trees and allowing the latex to drip into bowls, which will later be picked up by people in jugs. The average rubber tree yields about 19 pounds of latex annually, and it requires hundreds of thousands of trees a year to supply a rubber band business. The word rubber gets its name because the substance is able to rub off markings. One of the most important parts of the rubber band is the vulcanized rubber that makes it stretch. The vulcanization process is crucial to almost all rubber companies. There are rubber band companies that make different types that don't require rubber. There are synthetic companies. There are companies that do different types of mixes. It was invented by Charles Goodyear, who received the patent for the process on June 15th, 1844. This was a matter of contention during that time because Thomas Hancock had received a British patent for vulcanization that he had filed a year earlier, but did not become final until 1844. We'll hear more about Mr. Hancock later. There was a trial to determine whether Hancock had stolen the ideas. It was in England, and Goodyear attended, but in the end it was determined that a simple examination of the different types of rubber and their processes were not enough to determine if one man had stolen the ideas from the other one. When asked about the outcome of the trial, and his name being lost among the bustle of progress, he is quoted as saying, "Man has just cause for regret when he sows and no one reaps," which I took to mean, his invention was meant for all of us. Due to the trial, Goodyear was unable to claim any European royalties from his invention, because they were using rubber over there in Europe as well. But basically it was all under Thomas Hancock's name and patent, at the time. It is commonly known that while the company bearing his name, we're talking about Charles Goodyear, thrived, the namesake himself died penniless. The company was only named in his honor due to the vulcanization process being the bedrock for their entire business model. While not the subject of this episode, his death is particularly sad, and I figured I'd share it with you. Why not? He died at the age of 59 while traveling to see his dying daughter. When he arrived to see her, he was told that she had already passed, and at the sound of this news, he fainted, was taken to a hospital, and then died. So he died from hearing about someone else dying, which I just thought was pretty wild. The Goodyear Tire Company wouldn't be created for almost another 40 years after his passing. Okay, on to rubber bands. The first rubber band was patented in 1845 by Stephen Perry and Thomas Barnabas Daft. The story of rubber bands starts a little before that, though. In the early parts of the 19th century, sailors who had worked in the Central and South Americas would bring back their hauls and their souvenirs on the ships to England, and some of those souvenirs were made from the latex sap of rubber trees. These were things like footwear, garments, and bottles. And of course, people hadn't from in England hadn't seen these things before, so it was pretty interesting to them. The idea of the rubber band is credited to Thomas Hancock. There goes that man again, who in 1820 or thereabouts cut one of those rubber bottles into slices to create garters and waistbands. Hancock also created a machine called a masticator, which shreds the rubber and reforms it under pressure and heat, which at that time, before vulcanization, was one of the best ways to manipulate natural rubber. Before the introduction of rubber into society, things that were called elastic were not actually elastic the way that we know them to be, because we know them, we think of them to have a lot of rubber type qualities, but what they really were during that time were coiled metal or different levels of tension that they would apply to fabrics that would give it sort of elasticity to kind of say, but they weren't the elastics that we speak of. But that's everything at that time was basically elastic. The man who makes rubber bands into what we know them to be today is a man by the name of William H. Spencer, and he got his start cutting up rejected Goodyear inner tubes in 1923. He would take those strips of inner tubes to the Akron Beacon Journal and a few other publications and talk them into wrapping their papers in his bands that he had cut up from those inner tubes so they would not fly away on people's lawns. I believe the story goes that he would come home and see newspapers from other people's lawns spread across his and other places that they shouldn't be and think, well, why not? Let's wrap them up with my rubber, which sounds weird when you say it like that. This led to the creation of his company, Alliance Rubber Company, that was 1923, and this is now 2022. I just thought that was interesting to know. This company is almost 100 years old, and they're still a family-run business. The uses of rubber bands have developed over the years with the interesting. I thought that the U.S. Postal Service is the largest consumer of rubber bands in America. I would not have called that, but it makes sense. Like if it was a trivia question, who's the largest consumer? You would think newspapers, but it's not in 1985. But still, U.S. Postal Service is the largest consumer. And right behind them is the agricultural industry because they wrap all their produce in that, your asparagus and all that good stuff. And then the flower industry, which I didn't even think about, and I worked in the flower industry for a couple years. But there's a lot of rubber bands. When you look back, they are about the third leading consumer in rubber bands. And of course, competitors came on the market in the years that followed, but they're all going off that initial design that was created in the basement of William Spencer almost 100 years ago. I do have at least, I would say, one interesting fact, and then one note I want to make just in case anybody's listening out there. I'll make the note first that for like any history teachers out there or whatever, I do know that rubber dates back a long time, and I'm not like restricting the history of rubber itself to this 10-minute podcast and the 140, 50 years that we covered on it. I just don't want to hear any flack back about the lack of research that I did. It's just not really pertinent to rubber bands, guys. All right, but an interesting fact that I thought was that the rubber trees are not the only plants, if you will, that have milk that contain rubber-like qualities. Dandelions do the same. And so what people have tried to do is turn the milk from dandelions into the same kind of rubber. Some people specifically would be the Nazis in Germany. And I think it's interesting that there's always seems to be a connection back to Nazis. I personally didn't even know that dandelions made milk. I mean, I feel like I've heard that somewhere, but I've heard a lot of things over the years. But yeah, that's it, guys. That is it for the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Next week, we are doing stuffed animals, and it is more interesting than it sounds, believe it or not. Interestingly enough, this story also starts in Germany. So we'll see. Is there another connection to the Nazis next week? I don't know. Let's find out. Once again, I'm your host, Richard Dix, and it's been great.